Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for the Duke University Library's event, Beyond Supply and Demand. Duke economics students present 100 years of American women's suffrage. My name is Laura Mickham, and I'm the director of the Sally Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture. I want to mention that if my internet connection becomes unstable, I will ask my colleague, Megan Crane, to read the following logistical remarks and to introduce the panel. We've also pasted the next couple of paragraphs of remarks into the chat, as it's a lot of information. This event is using the Zoom webinar format. You'll notice that you're muted and your videos are turned off so that you can focus on the panel presentation, which will be followed by a short virtual guided tour of the suffrage exhibit. After the tour, we will open up to Q&A. You can type your question into the Q&A feature in Zoom, which you can open by clicking Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You can submit your questions anytime. And when the Q&A period opens up, my colleague Megan Crane will moderate the discussion by selecting questions for our speakers. This event will be recorded and we will share a link to the video soon. We ask for your understanding if we have technical issues, awkward pauses, or any other problems. If our speakers' internet connections become unstable or freeze, we will ask your patience as we work to resolve this. If this does not work, or we have other disruptions that we cannot resolve, we will end the meeting with the hopes of recording a version of the program and sharing it with all who registered. During this event, we will explore the question, how did 38 economics students end up curating an exhibit on the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and what was the process like? The fall 2019 class, Women in the Economy, explored the historical and present realities of the status of women in relation to labor and the economy, with the suffrage movement as the focal point, and a major library exhibit as the culminating project. Many of the items in this exhibit are part of the Lisa Unger Baskin collection, a transformative collection of over 17,000 items documenting women at work that came to Duke 6 years ago this month. Joining me to tell this story, the story of this amazing course, are the resourceful faculty member who taught it, Jenna Miller, lecturing fellow of economics, the dedicated intern who worked on every aspect of the project, from class sessions to completed exhibit, Jess Epston, graduate student, UNC School of Library and Information Science, one of the intrepid and creative students in the class, Cheyenne Quijano, Trinity 22, economics and computer science major, and the wizard of our exhibitions program, Meg Brown, head, exhibition services, and E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation exhibits librarian. Professor Miller, I invite you to start us off.
Hi, so how did these economics students end up curating an exhibit about women's suffrage? Well, I teach the course Women in the Economy, and as an economics course and a social science course, the students in our department are really good with the science part, the supply and demand. But they don't always know as much about the social side of the social science. So next slide, please. I like to do a lot of the social and historical context around women's status in the economy. And I do start with the suffrage movement, go to the civil rights and women's liberation movement of the 60s, through to girl power and transnational feminism in the 80s and 90s, and then through to today with the Me Too movement and other current issues. And a lot of the current issues, of course, students really connect with. But I always had a hard time getting them to connect with the suffrage movement because it was over 100 years ago. So I began about 5 or 6 years ago working with the library resources. Next slide. So that instead of using a traditional pedagogy in which I would lecture to the students and they would listen to me or they would read something, instead they'd have a more active approach where they would actually be doing something and they would discover information for themselves. So there enters the Rubenstein Library collection with items from all of these different time periods. And back in 2018, I realized, oh my goodness, in 2020, it's going to be 100 years of women's right to vote. We should really do something. So I asked Laura about doing something, and she suggested that my students could indeed curate an exhibit. Next slide. And so I wondered, can economics students actually curate an exhibit? Will they be able to have those skills? How are we going to do this? And what exactly are my students going to learn about women in the economy from doing this project? Next slide. And what I found was that thinking about Bloom's taxonomy of learning was that actually my students were able to get to a much higher level of learning. Instead of just remembering and understanding what happened or even applying and analyzing, they were able to actually touch items from 100 years ago and evaluate what was important to them and then create displays. So they really got a lot of learning from this project. And now in terms of the how exactly did we do all of this, I'd like to turn it over to Jess.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. My name is Jess Epston, and I'm a master's student at the School of Information and Library Science at UNC Chapel Hill. And as Laura said, I was the graduate student intern last year at the Rubenstein Library, working specifically on this exhibit. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this type of collaboration between the Rubenstein and a semester-long class like Dr. Miller's is such an exciting but massive undertaking. So for me as a librarian in training, I really wanted to facilitate positive experiences for the students within the archive and using primary sources, while also supporting them in thinking critically about research and archival material. Having 38 students find items about suffrage within our entire collection would have taken many weeks out of the semester. So because of our limited time and the sheer size and scope of our collection, the first thing I did was to help facilitate making this project a little bit more manageable. So I did a lot of preliminary searching of the entire archive for suffrage-related materials and created what we call a known universe for the students. I spent about a month going through the archive, selecting items and grouping them within some general themes. So there were many items that were already very well known in our collection, like the suffrage pins, the suffrage sashes, which you can see there in the bottom right hand picture. But I also did a lot of more in-depth searching of our catalog, even using some of our old school card catalog for lesser known items, and specifically items that were local to Duke and Durham. So on the slide, you can see some examples of items we pulled. And on the bottom left-hand image, this is what a typical manuscript folder might look like. So I was combing many, many folders, looking through all dozens and dozens of small items and ephemera. I was reading a lot of letters between suffragists. I found lots of little things like suffrage association membership cards and leaflets and photos and maps. And I even went through a few personal scrapbooks of Duke alumna, which was really cool. So this was just a really fun and exciting for me because every day was different and something new. And I also want to say another thing we kept in mind throughout this process was taking very special care to include marginalized voices, particularly women of color. And I talked a lot about this with Meg and Laura, but a complicated part about telling history through an exhibit is, you want something physical to show. And sometimes that doesn't exist for marginalized communities because their voices are so often not recorded in history and often actively suppressed. So while much of the suffrage material in the collection is focused on white suffragists, and engaging with a lot of secondary source research, from important suffrage scholars like Dr. Nell Painter, Dr. Rosalind Turberg Penn, and Dr. Ann Gordon, we were able to follow these important names of Black suffragists like Anna Julia Cooper, Frances Ann Watkins Harper, Mary Church Terrell, and more, and have included rich examples of their activism from our collection in the exhibit. Next slide, please. So after that preliminary search process, we had the first library instruction with our students where we presented this known universe to them. And it ended up being over 100 items, so they had a lot to choose from. And these are some pictures of the students looking over all the materials and choosing an item that resonated with them. So once the students picked out their item for the exhibit, my next role was to support them throughout the semester in their analysis and research. This involved a lot of great one-on-one reference meetings, guiding students and continuing to search in the archives, as well as for secondary sources online and in Perkins. I worked with the students to research and understand the context and significance of their item within the history of suffrage and how to best present it within the exhibit. One moment that stuck out was when I met with a student who chose a play about suffrage that was annotated by a local Durham suffragist named Mary Calper. And the student came to our reference meeting wanting to, research the origins of the play and learn more about Mary Calper, which we did together. But also in that meeting, we started asking bigger questions, like what was the purpose of the play and why did this local suffragist annotate the play? Which got us to talking about the importance of theater and art and social movements and art as activism, which sent her down another research path, which she was really excited about. So it was really great to have these meaningful generative one-on-one interactions with students to support them in digging deeper. Next slide, please. Thank you. So of course, because of COVID, we had to make a lot of changes in the spring. We transitioned the exhibit to an online space at first, which was also a big undertaking. Laura, Meg, and I spent much of the spring semester of 2020 building the online exhibit, and I'm so excited about how it turned out. Here's an example. Here's the homepage with the link if you want to check that out. And I hope that the students are really glad to see their hard work online and so easily accessible. And of course, now I'm thrilled to celebrate with you all today the opening of the in-person exhibit. I'm sure Meg will tell you more about that. So yeah, just in conclusion, for me as a librarian, these types of projects that are incorporated into the classroom are invaluable because first, it creates positive, exciting, and hands-on experiences in the library and with rare materials. And second, it's so amazing for students to be able to make connections to the past in order to understand our present and envision our future. So I've just been so grateful to be a part of this project. And now I'm thrilled to introduce Cheyenne Quijano, a student from the class who is going to speak on her experience.
Thanks, Jess. We can go to the next slide. So yeah, my name's Cheyenne, and I took Dr. Miller's Women in the Economy course in my sophomore fall. And I focused on the topic of religion in the context of the suffrage movement. So in talking about like the selection and research of this project, it really involved finding key sources to highlight about religion within the movement and exploring this historical context behind the sources we chose, and also ensuring that intersectionality was of key importance in the exhibit, just because marginalized voices and just making sure those were heard in exhibits is really important. And thankfully, Jess did a lot of the grunt work for us, and everyone in the library was in Rubenstein was just extremely helpful in helping us come up with a really great story to tell and finding key sources. So the first, the main source that I looked into was the Women's Bible, which was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the revising committee of 24 different women. And there was no translation of the Bible yet at the time that had any women contributors. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the revising committee really wanted to give people a women's perspective of the interpretations in the Bible, just because it was so often used to support different or refute like certain social issues. So during that time, it really made me think about why it was so critical to know like who the author was, knowing the context and how that changes meaning and interpretations. And some of the interesting things that I found from that source was that the Women's Bible actually was something that split the movement, the suffrage movement, because the National American Women's Suffrage Association actually didn't want to be associated with the Women's Bible because they felt that since it was so controversial, because religion was so entrenched in the social environment, that it would actually damage the effort for women's rights itself. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton thought it was important, and we think it's important today to highlight, of course. And we also wanted to make sure that we had combination of both textual and visual sources. So you can see like in the left picture, the middle of the picture is an illustration of Esther, and that was from the Rubenstein collection from Arthur's site. And this really highlighted like the strength of women and having like a really like beautiful visual source to accompany like the stories that were told in the Women's Bible. And we also had a picture, you can see the third picture on the left, of Reverend Hannaford, and she was one of the first lesbian ministers and one contributor to the Women's Bible as well. And she was actually alienated from her congregation because of her queer identity and because she was also very active in the suffrage movement. So to find the source, actually, we had to contact the Nantucket Historical Association. And it turns out that the associate director, her name is Amelia Holmes, she was a former Rubenstein Library intern. So just, yes, that Duke connection. And she was, of course, happy to allow us to share the image, which was just really interesting to do this research and just find how it relates to Duke as well. And the other two people that were in my group, one person looked into a women's suffrage leaflet in support of women's suffrage. So it was called Jesus Christ, the Emancipator of Women. And another person looked at the opposite argument used by different ministers, which was women's suffrage of reform against nature. So again, there were just so many people and ministers, especially, that used the Bible to support and refute passing women's suffrage. And it's just really important, I think, to provide all the perspectives that existed at the time and just to highlight women's voices and marginalized voices as well. And now I can pass on to Meg.
Hi. Hi, I'm Meg Brown, Head of Exhibition Services for Duke University Libraries and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation's librarian. Jess explained earlier how we worked with the students to get them to the layout stage of exhibition design. We usually do this step in our exhibition prep space in the basement of the library, in an area that allows us to precisely mimic the cases of the exhibition gallery. But due to the number of students, we needed to do this in the Holste-Anderson family assembly room so that we could all be together. A layout is a process that requires taking all of the collection materials and draft labels and laying them out in a measured space, making sure everything fits, and looking for things that might be missing, or considering how we might display the materials in the most visually appealing way. Next slide, please. Back in November of 2019, when we were creating the layout with the students, we believed we were preparing for an exhibition to be installed in August of 2020 in the Mary Duke Biddle Room, shown here on the top of this slide. Each of the 10 groups of students had one section of the upright cases against the walls on either side of the room. They each had approximately 3 feet by 4.5 feet of space to tell their part of the suffrage story. We conducted this layout in November. We talked and walked through all 10 groups, and we ended the class feeling great about the exhibition. The plan was that after the class ended, the library staff would then move the exhibition through the final stages, including creating graphics, making cradles, editing text, and printing and mounting labels. We thought we had plenty of time, and we were looking forward to the install in the midsummer, with an opening just in time for the suffrage anniversary of the ratification of the amendment on August 18th, 2020. But then COVID hit and everything changed. When it was decided to keep the library closed to the public for the fall 2020 semester, it no longer made sense to install the exhibition in the Mary Duke Biddle Room. But as time passed, after watching the number of students who still entered the library and passed through our Chappell family gallery, shown at the bottom of this slide, we decided it would be valuable to our on-campus students, staff, and faculty to install the exhibition into that space. We were able to offer an appointment system so that students could visit safely, and we were able to give the students who curated the exhibition the opportunity to come by and view their work in its final form. But the exhibition did have to undergo a lot of changes in order to move from a space with essentially 5 cases to a gallery with 10 cases and almost twice as much square footage.
Thank you, Meg, and the rest of the panelists. That is the end of our slide presentation, and now we're going to transition to our virtual tour, which will take us just a moment.
During the spring and summer of 2020, we all experienced so many changes, political, social, and emotional, that we felt a need to revisit the exhibit. Due to COVID, we had a little bit more time, and due to the change of venue, we were able to add more stories and still design the exhibition to show and support the work the students had curated. You're now watching a video that I created using the camera on my phone. Due to the potential technology issues that can occur in virtual meetings, we decided to pre-record this video, but Laura and I are still talking live. We wanted a chance to make you feel like you were with us in the library. So I've walked you in through the front door and past our Rubenstein Library reading room, through the Documentary Arts Gallery, and now we are in the Jerry and Bruce Family Gallery. Laura?
One of the biggest challenges for the students, as it was for us librarians who worked with them, is that the full range of contributions to the American women's suffrage movement is not represented in the Rubenstein Library's collections or in the historical record generally. The dominant narrative of the movement, like the historical record of it, has focused on white women who benefited from the passage of the 19th Amendment more than Black, Indigenous, and women of color. In order to acknowledge and grapple with this, we included a statement in the online exhibit and here in the physical exhibit as well, entitled "What's Missing?" The statement acknowledges our responsibility for this imbalance in our collections and declares our commitment to sharing a diversity of historical figures and viewpoints throughout this exhibit and to center Black, Indigenous, and people of color, individuals and communities in our collecting and descriptive practices. The first case we want to share is entitled Abolition, Racism, and Resistance. Because the idea for the suffrage movement began at an anti-slavery conference and borrowed much of its methodology from the abolition movement, it made sense to begin the exhibition here. We are approaching that case right now. It was equally important to look at all of the 10 themes in the exhibit through the lens of race and resistance. The fight for suffrage was diverse from its inception. Many African-American women, such as Sojourner Truth, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and Mary Church Terrell, all featured in this case, fought for human rights through their work in women's clubs, churches, and suffrage organizations. These groups were concerned not just with suffrage, but also with life and death issues such as lynching. At the same time, many white suffragists and anti-suffragists upheld racist arguments, often dividing the movement and excluding Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The objects in this section recount the abolitionist roots of the suffrage movement and the efforts of Black women to secure universal suffrage in spite of the racism within the movement and the continued voter suppression after the passage of the 19th Amendment. I want to start with feminist and abolitionist Sojourner Truth, whose image you see right here in front of you. One of the towering figures of the 19th century America, Sojourner Truth was born into slavery in 1797 on a rural farm in Ulster County, New York. At the age of 30, she drew strength from her Christian faith and found the courage to escape and become an itinerant preacher. Between 1863 and 1875, Truth had at least 14 different photographic portraits made, like the one you see here. She sold them to provide income for herself. She controlled every aspect of the way she was depicted in these images. Truth once commented, she, quote, used to be sold for other people's benefit, but now she sold herself for her own. This broadside advertises a speech Truth gave around 1880. Truth's image and the testimonials from other renowned activists, such as suffragist Susan B. Anthony and abolitionist Frederick Douglass, attest to Truth's ability to inspire others to fight for abolition and suffrage and to recognize their shared goals. And here, we're about to see letters written by Susan B. Anthony that include her signature. In these letters, Anthony writes to Mrs. Minnie Rohde, chair of the Women's Club in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to recommend a push for voting rights legislation before the territory is granted statehood, since that would extend the process for granting suffrage. Although advocating for abolition in the 19th century, Anthony shows her prejudice against people of color, expressing her opposition to voting rights for racial minorities, stating, quote, I read yesterday of the number of Indians and Mexicans and Negroes that were in the territories. It is amazing that people want to make a state out of a territory composed of a majority of what we should term incompetence. Voting should be confined to intelligent beings. In order to offer additional illustrations of the resistance and good trouble of Black women suffragists, we include portraits and works of abolitionist writer, speaker, suffragist, and temperance leader, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, whom you see here, who believed adamantly in acknowledging the racism faced by Black people and how that could not be separated from the struggle for equality, including within the suffrage movement, as well as activist, suffragist, journalist, and the first president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, NACWC, Mary Church Terrell, whom you see here, Terrell and the NACWC began organizing and lobbying for Black women's rights in the late 19th century in response to Jim Crow and the continued institutionalization of racism and segregation. In her autobiography shown here, Terrell recounts her speeches made to the National American Women's Suffrage Association at the invitation of Susan B. Anthony and how attending suffrage meetings influenced her work in women's clubs.
We've now moved on to this case, which covers the theme of art and culture. In the late 19th century, in response to decades of cartoons mocking progressive women in publications like Puck, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and later the National Women's Party, created press and publicity to produce media that was accessible to people of all educational and socioeconomic backgrounds. One example shown here was the poster of lawyer, journalist, socialist reformer, and activist Inez Milholland Boissevain, who became an icon and martyr for the suffrage movement. Also note the beautiful design of pins displayed here. The blue penna pin represents the first National Women's Suffrage Parade. On the other side of the case, you can see this striking Votes for Women bluebird tin sign. The Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association produced 100,000 of these as a means of spreading information surrounding the Massachusetts suffrage referendum on November 2nd, 1915, which unfortunately ultimately failed. Also seen here is How the Vote Was Won, a satirical play written in 1909 by British suffragist Cicely Hamilton. This is the copy Cheyenne discussed, which was annotated by Mary Calper, a local resident, who edited the play to make it more applicable to life in Durham, North Carolina.
Cheyenne shared her experience of developing the content of the next case we want to show you, the Bible as tool. I want to share a little bit more about those items. The Bible played a complex role in the women's suffrage movement. Religious convictions compelled many to campaign and others to fight vehemently against granting women the right to vote. Women viewed the right to vote not only as a political and social issue, but also as a moral issue, as did their opponents. The items in this section showcase how pro and anti-suffragists used God and interpretations of biblical teachings and writings to reinforce their arguments. I want to call attention in particular, as Cheyenne did, to the Women's Bible published in 1898. Written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a committee of 26 women, the Women's Bible challenged the traditional position of religious orthodoxy that women should be subservient to man. Stanton's book-by-book examination of the Bible introduced the idea that a correct interpretation of the Bible supports women's rights, sparking antagonism amongst those in the suffrage movement who believed that its controversial nature would damage their efforts for women's rights. The Women's Bible found a new home among second wave or mid-20th century feminist activists and scholars of religion who saw in Stanton a feminist forerunner in her Bible and a validation of their own efforts. I also want to show this portrait of Phoebe Hannaford again, because she's such a favorite of ours. Because she worked on the Women's Bible. Reverend Phoebe Hannaford was an abolitionist author and the fourth female Quaker minister in the world, and may have been the first lesbian minister.
Now we'll move on to the case with the theme of labor, which might seem the most obvious subject for our economics students. But trying to visualize and curate women's labor struggles did give this group a challenge. Historically, women recognized that to rectify the inequality of compensation and working conditions, they needed a voice in the political arena, and the publications in this case display some of the work to bring attention to these issues. Shown here, in just a second, is a picture of labor activist Lucy Randolph Mason with her pamphlet, The Divine Discontent, published in 1912. Mason asserts in this pamphlet that women's suffrage is needed to elevate women as a class and depicts the women's suffrage movement as an inevitable success and an essential part of the larger labor movement. A similar pamphlet seen here, Suffrage for Women Wage Earners, asserts that women workers will inevitably earn lower wages than men unless they are enfranchised. The author of this pamphlet was Ida H. Harper, a women's suffrage journalist who was also Susan B. Anthony's biographer and co-author of History of Women's Suffrage. And finally, here you see a picture of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton next to a copy of The Revolution, which was published from 1868 to 1872. The Revolution, an official publication of the National Women's Suffrage Association, was the first weekly newspaper devoted to women's rights. This copy from February 5th, 1868, shows articles with columns on unionization, discrimination against female workers, pay equity, prostitution, and other topics that might hold working class women's attention.
This tour would not be complete if we didn't share some local and Duke history as well. Beginning in the late 19th century, North Carolina suffragists and their supporters saw the state amendment extending the vote to women through local as well as national organizing efforts. After the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, the League of Women Voters North Carolina was formed to educate and encourage active participation by new women voters in public policy issues. Faculty and students at Duke, which was the site of one of the first 4 North Carolina League of Women Voters chapters, continued to work on behalf of women voters. The items in this section illustrate moments in this decades-long history. One of our favorites is the photograph you see here of the members of the Duke League of Women Voters chapter. In 1926, the Athena and Brooks Literary Societies at Duke unified as the Duke League of Women Voters chapter. Supported by Mary Octavine Calper, the regional leader of the National League, the group worked to educate and inform their peers about voting, as well as local, state, and national government. Though the federal amendment was passed in 1920, it took decades of persistent advocacy by this group and successor organizations to finally convince North Carolina's legislature to endorse women's suffrage in 1971. As in several other cases in this exhibit and in suffrage exhibits presented by other institutions this year, we included short profiles of prominent voting rights activists. In the local lives case, we included Maddie Southgate Jones, Gertrude Weil, and Mary Octavine Calper. Maddie Southgate Jones, whose image you see here, was born in Lewisburg, North Carolina, and moved to Durham as a teenager, where she was an active member of several North Carolina organizations, including the Durham Equal Suffrage League, as well as the Equal Suffrage Association of North Carolina, of which she served as chair. Within the women's suffrage movement, Jones was deeply engaged in developing political strategy, lobbying state senators, and facilitating petition drives around the region, including on the Trinity College campus, a predecessor to Duke. Gertrude Weil, a social activist who is amongst the women in the portrait you see here, was involved in women's suffrage, labor reform, and civil rights. She was born in Goldsboro, North Carolina, to German Jewish immigrants, and in 1913, she formed the North Carolina Equal Suffrage League in Charlotte. After the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Weil helped to establish and became president of the North Carolina League of Women Voters. Mary Octavine Calper, whom you see here, is a sociologist and community activist, and worked with the Durham Equal Suffrage League before co-founding the North Carolina League of Women Voters in 1920 with Gertrude Weil. Calper aimed to register at least 75% of eligible women voters, enlist the assistance of women's clubs to lobby for the League's legislative goals, and support local League chapters, such as the chapter formed at Duke in 1926. Duke faculty were also active in the League. Catherine Banham, a pioneering professor of psychology at Duke and a leader in the League of Women Voters Durham, likely helped to produce the brochure you see here entitled What We Are, which was used to promote the League's advocacy efforts and to recruit new members in Durham. It provides a brief profile of the mission and work of the local chapter, which is still active today as the League of Women Voters Orange, Durham, and Chatham Counties Incorporated. The final section of the exhibit, The Long Tale of Voting Rights, shows the continued conversation around women's rights and voting rights after the passage of the 19th Amendment. After 1920, there were invigorated movements to educate and mobilize new women voters and fight against voter suppression tactics like literacy laws and intimidation at the polls that disproportionately disenfranchised Black, Indigenous, and people of color. One of the leaders of these movements was Fannie Lou Hamer, whose image you see here, who, having personally experienced literacy tests and poll tax requirements, became a field secretary for voter registration and welfare programs with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. In this role, and as leader of the Freedom Democratic Party, she helped and encouraged thousands of African Americans to become registered voters. In her 1971 speech, which she titled "Nobody's Free Until Everybody's Free," she told the National Women's Political Caucus in Washington that Black and white women had to work together toward freedom for all. The image of Hamer in the exhibit was taken by Vaughn Cliffs in 1967. Given her status as a Duke alumna, Women's College 1961, and founder of the Feminist Majority Foundation, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to advance women's power, equality, and economic development, it was fitting to include Eleanor Smeal in this exhibition. Her 1984 book, which you see here, Why and How Women Will Elect the Next President, served as a tool for women pursuing roles in electoral politics. It was an empowering resource and step-by-step guide to educating women by means of quantitative data on the importance of their involvement in elections and participation in campaigns related to abortion rights, sexual harassment, and income disparity.
Our last step in this tour is to visit a case that displays work completed by students, staff, faculty, and alumni during COVID. In honor of the history of artistic expression of political ideals, such as sewing banners, pennants, sashes, and other items, we created a friendly competition, inviting people to submit their own artistic expressions inspired by the 100th anniversary of the American women's suffrage movement. Submissions reference the suffrage movement as well as other voting rights struggles. You can see here some beautiful craftsmanship and attention to detail. You might also notice a little COVID inspiration, as well as perhaps some inspiration coming from the elections of 2020. I also want to point out this reproduction of a work created by a Duke student and her mother. The original is a decoupage of vintage newspaper clippings, paint, and actual pennies. It was inspirational to me to imagine these two women creating this work together, celebrating the suffrage movement in the midst of a worldwide pandemic. That concludes our tour for the day. I'll pass us out with a little bit of footage of the library in case you're missing our beautiful architecture. We can't wait to see you when it's safe to open our doors again soon. Before I pass this back to Laura, I want to take one personal moment and say happy birthday to my sister, Kathy, if she's still on. I hope you're having a great day. Laura?
Thank you, Meg. And thank you for joining us on this tour. We will now transition to a question and answer period with our panelists, moderated by my colleague, Megan Crane, and that transition will take just a moment. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much to our panelists and to Laura and Meg for that excellent look at our exhibit. It felt a little bit like I was back in the library, which I really appreciate at this point in time. So we have a little bit of time here at the end for questions for any of our panelists. So just as a reminder, you can ask a question by clicking Q&A at the bottom of your screen and typing the question into the box. And we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. So I think we're gonna start out with a question for Cheyenne. If you could tell us about opportunities you may have had to use any skills you developed in the Women in the Economy class.
Yeah, of course. It was, of course, really exciting to work on the exhibit and to share it with you all and to really just show the fruits of our research labor. And this class was one of my first experiences with qualitative research in economics, because of course, like what Dr. Miller said, like a lot of economics research is quantitative. So I've just learned so much from this class and other classes of the importance of qualitative research to field the questions for quantitative research. And right now I'm currently doing economics research with Marjorie McElroy, who's another professor of economics in Duke's econ department, on how abortion restrictions have affected the marriage markets. And a lot of the work that we do is looking at contextual information, like during historical events, and really critically examining the sources. And that's just something that I've spent time doing over and over again after this course and project. And because of this course, it's one of the reasons why I'm really seriously considering pursuing graduate school in economics as a result.
Thank you. Very exciting. Let's see. It looks like we have a question for Meg. How was your experience of working with this class? How has your experience of working with this class impacted your vision for future collaboration with Duke classes and other student groups?
So Jenna was incredibly generous and patient with us as we went through this process. We tried to support the students in doing exhibits in different ways. And this was a more formalized version of this where it was a part of the assignment, and the students really engaged during the class time in a way that was kind of inspirational for me. And it made me believe even more than ever that exhibits should be a part of their process as often as they can. And so we really are trying to offer our exhibit spaces as much as we can have the personnel to do so, to support them to tell these historical stories from their perspective, but also to use the library collections, learn about research processes, and learn about how to talk to people in short bursts and figure out what the most important part of a story is to tell in a short period of time. So we're currently working with a class of right now for an exhibit that will go up in 2022 on Latinx history at Duke. And I talked about Jenna's class all the time when I was working with this new faculty member and these students. And I'm just thankful that the students have such a great opportunity and that they're faculty who are willing to spend the time to work with us on this.
Thanks, Meg. Jenna, maybe a similar question from your end. How do you plan on to make use of the online exhibit in future classes?
That's a great question. And I actually, in the fall 2020 semester, made use of the exhibit. My students in that semester of Women in the Economy were assigned to visit the virtual version of the exhibit, and they had to each choose a theme that they found interesting and then an item within the theme to explain why they thought it was interesting and be critical about their discussion. And one of the things I found especially fascinating was that a lot of the students were interested in visiting men's perspectives on women's right to vote, which was one of the parts. I don't believe we showed that one, but I was surprised that that was the most popular one for my students last semester to visit. So I plan to have other future semesters have the students visit as well.
Thanks, Jenna. Laura, why don't we have you talk a little bit about the Sally Bingham Center and how it supports Duke students?
Sure. So the Sally Bingham Center has existed for over 30 years now. We are a broad-based women's history archive and library, and we exist to collect and preserve and provide access to women's history material, documenting women past and present, format agnostic. We have all the formats you can imagine. And thanks to the Unger Baskin collection, which I mentioned earlier, the collection goes all the way back to the 14th century. And thanks to the good and great work of Kelly Wooten and others in the Bingham Center, the collection comes all the way forward to the present day. So none of this, though, would be possible without working with students like Jess Epstein, who take our collections from boxes and folders and acid-free envelopes and literally bring them to life, in these wonderful and very vibrant collaborations with faculty like Jenna Miller and students like Cheyenne Quijano. So this is really the best part of our job, is to bring these collections to life this way and to be able to share them in programs like we have today.
Thanks, Laura. Jenna, it looks like we have another question for you. As a proponent of hands-on pedagogy, I hope Jenna will share the enthusiasm of students for the opportunity to do this. How do you suggest we get more faculty to do this? And are you writing up your faculty experience to share with others?
Well, first, most students were really excited. It was actually very sweet to see that students would sort of bond with the item that they chose. And they would constantly refer to it as my item. And there was one student who chose the cookbook. And apparently he would go back to the library to visit his cookbook. So students seemed really excited. And at the end of the semester, I did do a sort of informal survey to find out students' opinions, and the majority of students were really excited and really enjoyed the process. I think they also really liked the idea of being able to share what they learned with the rest of the world, with the public, and having their names get to be seen there. In terms of sharing some of the findings, I'm really hoping that our band here can get together and maybe publish something, or put something out on the internet. I'm always, and in terms of getting other faculty to do more hands-on, I'm always telling people about how great this project has been, and how as an instructor, I've really enjoyed it and I've been excited about it. And I recommend to other professors all the time, you should really, especially even just telling them, you should see what we have at our library and go there and visit and share it with students. So yeah, I've loved this project. It's been amazing.
Hey, Megan, can I just add the personal side to this? One of my favorite moments in the whole process was we were asking the students for feedback about how this process went. And one of the students, this young sort of humorous young man who had a little bit of a sense of humor, got kind of serious and said that he went to New York over one of the breaks and was talking with his grandmother. And he just went into a relatively sentimental moment in which he talked about how meaningful it was to have a conversation with his grandmother in which they were on the same page, and she got so excited that he was interested in things that she had experienced, and he sort of just shared this really special family moment. And for me, that was just like the cutting past the educational piece. It obviously had sort of touched him a little bit. That was pretty great.
That's really wonderful. You should save that story and tell it a lot, because that's a great story. It looks like we have a question for any of our panelists who'd like to answer. So when looking through the archives, were there any items found that prompted further questions, and maybe further questions that could become another exhibit?
So I have a couple of ideas, because I think I had a chance to see that question, but I see other wheels spinning. So I'm going to jump in and have my ideas and hope that other people want to jump in too. So two of the ideas that came to me as we were looking through this material is, again, given the extraordinary material in the Lisa Unger Baskin collection that documents suffrage, but then women at work generally over the course of 5 centuries. One of the things that excites me is the possibility of doing an exhibit that actually puts on display the connection of the suffrage movement and other feminist movements, especially in the 19th century, with other kinds of women working in the public sphere, and particularly women in medicine, women in science, and women in literature. I think that could be, a fascinating exploration of the 19th century women's movement. And then following on that, it has always been of interest to me as an archivist whose life is to document many generations of the feminist movement, to have an exhibit that shows that each feminist movement has historical antecedents, right? So in this exhibit, Cheyenne and I talked about the fact that there's an edition of the Women's Bible that we included that was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others in the late 19th century, but then republished in the middle 20th century by second wave feminists. So this kind of sort of print culture, this trajectory of print culture in the feminist movement is a great interest of mine, and I think it could make for a great exhibit. Other ideas?
Sure. I think what interested me the most doing all this research was digging into, and some people have been chatting about this in the chat as well, but the conflicts between white suffragists and Black suffragists. And I think it would be really interesting to delve a little bit more into that, especially because we have a ton of materials on the original minutes of these of the women's suffrage meetings. And I found it really fascinating because it wasn't that, Black women, like Laura said, were always involved in the movement. But it was often that their ideas and their activism was around so much more than just suffrage. And I think it would be really interesting to do an exhibit that really focused on that and how that connects to today and what we're seeing today with some frictions and feminism. Again, so sort of tying into what Laura said about looking at past to sort of see where we are today in the present. And yeah, but specifically looking at the race issue.
All right, thanks. We have a question, Jenna, I'm not sure if you would know this off the top of your head. Someone would like to know what percentage of the class was male?
It was probably around 40%. It was less than half, but a significant amount. It was definitely, I usually I've never had majority men in that class, but I usually have, around 50%. I would say it was a little bit less this time. So there were quite a few men in the class, and it was interesting to see their reactions, and especially some of the literature that argued that women shouldn't have the right to vote because they're irrational or their wombs would shrink and things like that. All of the students were shocked by that, but there were a few men in particular, I remember saying, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe this." So I think it was really wonderful that there were men in the class to see these items firsthand.
All right, it looks like we have time for one more question. And so we're gonna end on a question for Jess. Now that a few months have passed from completing the online exhibit, what has stuck with you about working with the students during this class and then working to realize their vision through the exhibit?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, what stuck with me is just what an undertaking this was for the students, and seeing them, start with a topic that maybe they didn't know that much about, and maybe working with materials, hands-on that they had never done before, something they'd never done before, and doing all this work to write an entire research paper on an object, and then turning that paper into 150 to 200 word exhibit label. Doing that and fitting it within the themed case and within the suffrage story as a whole, I was just so impressed with what they were able to do, and how they really challenged themselves to do different types of research. And also, I was thinking too about what Meg was saying and just how much inspiration they got from the exhibit, and how, that one story that Meg told, I feel like there were a couple other stories like that, and how they got to have discussions with their family members, and how that sort of, again, these types of projects always sort of move beyond the classroom, which I think makes them really powerful. And I just learned so much from the students. I always do when I teach, so that was just so wonderful.
Thank you. So I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today, and of course a special thanks to our panelists. There are some amazing conversations and stories being shared in our chat right now. So thank you all for being here and for sharing your stories and your experiences. It's so clear to me just looking at what's happening in the chat right now that this exhibit's really special for lots of different reasons, and special to lots of people. So thank you. So if you're interested in viewing this or any of our other online exhibits, you can do so at library.duke.edu/exhibits. The URL is on the screen right now. If you'd like to be informed of any other events we hold or news from the libraries, you can also sign up for our newsletter or follow us on social media. all of which you can do at our website, library.duke.edu. We have recorded this event and we'll be sharing the link to the video very soon, and would invite and welcome you to share that out with any friends or family or colleagues who might be interested in viewing our presentation. So thank you again to everyone for joining us today, and have an excellent weekend. Thank you.